Okay, so we're going to try that one again. I apologize that it crashed out on me. So bear with me while I build up the file again. I've got to go through and make those shapes. Most of you are already there, but I have to go back through it anyway. So I'll move rather quickly through this. I'm going to take layer 1, call it environment. I'll take layer 2 and call that one infinite plane. I'll take layer 3 and I'll call it directional light. I'll take the infinite plane and directional light layers and move them underneath the environment layer. Then I'll take layer 4 and layer 5. I held down shift there to select them both and press the delete key. Then on the directional light layer, we'll establish a directional light. So I'll give myself a little cheater object. And then we'll go ahead with my directional light. And let me turn on my endpoint snap, my mid, and my perpendicular. And we'll go from there to there. Perfect. I've got pieces that are disappearing on me. That's that OpenGL problem. So we'll go ahead and change that as well. Tools, options, view, OpenGL, turn off that tessellation. And now I'll be able to see my objects. I need my infinite plane. We'll make that the current layer, and we'll add my V-Ray infinite plane. I am going to change the color of that layer to make it a little bit easier on the eyes. So we'll switch that. And we'll also switch this into shaded mode so I can see what I'm doing. OK, next piece here, we're going to move back up to the default layer, and I'm going to create those objects. First one will be the wall at the back. So this was at 12 feet, 1 foot, and then it's 8 feet tall. So I'll do 8 feet. There it is. Next one was just a simple cube. So I'll use the box primitive to do at 4 feet, 4 feet. And then that will be 4 feet tall. Next to that, we'll do the cylinder. So the cylinder, my diameter is going to be 4 feet, and my height would be 4 feet as well. I'm going to do a sphere. There's my sphere right there. My diameter is going to be 4 feet. It's below the ground, so I'm going to type move. And I want to move vertically. And since it's 4 feet, I need to move half the distance, so it would be 2 feet up. Now it's sitting on the ground there. A couple more. Under my primitives here, we'll do a cone. My diameter will be set at 4 feet. And my height here will also be set at 4 feet. And the last one would be the pyramid. I'm going to change the number of sides to be just 4 instead of 5. And then we'll do it at 4 feet. That is definitely too big. How about 2 feet there? There we go. That's a little bit better. And we'll go ahead and make that 4 feet tall there as well. So I've set up these basic primitives so that when we're working and we're doing our texture mapping, it's easy to kind of see. I'm going to start today by working on just the box. And for you guys, you don't have to hide the other objects. I'm going to be hiding the other objects just for clarity when I'm demonstrating in lecture, though you guys won't have to. So I'm going to take all the rest of these objects. I'm going to type in hide so that I'm working just with this one box. So let me zoom, selected. There it is. I have just that box that I'm going to work with. Now when we start to explore textures or materials, it doesn't make sense to have when we're doing this texture mapping to pick a material that doesn't really require texture mapping. So a metal, for example, that has no seams in it, just kind of a generic gold or something, this would look like a gold block. I don't have to perform any texture mapping because there's no repeating pattern. So when it comes to selecting a material, I want to make sure that I'm selecting a material that has a distinct repeating pattern. And so I'm going to open up that V-Ray asset editor right here. I'll go to my materials section. I'll pull the drawer out to the left. And I'm going to pick something that has a strong repeating pattern. And so a good example of that would be brick. So there's a bunch of brick that's included in here. You can pick any one of the bricks that you want. I'm going to try this weathered brick for the fun of it. I'm going to drag that weathered brick over into my material list here. There it is. And I want that to be applied to this object. So I'll right-click on the weathered bricks and say Apply Material to Selection. I now have that weathered brick material showing up on this object. So because this is in shaded mode, I'm not seeing the material. I can switch from shaded mode into rendered mode, and I should be able to see a preview of the material. This is not a perfectly accurate preview of the material, but it's close. And so while it's not a true rendered version, it's reasonable. It gives us some place to start when we start to look at this object. So by default, when V-Ray applies a material, it essentially takes the picture of the material on each side and throws it at the object. And then it sticks on the object. So by default, the box doesn't look horrible. It might be, the scale might be a little off, but it's not too bad. But we can still refine it. So what I'm going to do that, actually, let me go ahead and lock the environment layer so I can't accidentally select it. I'm going to select my box, and I'm going to go over here into my properties. And so instead of being on layer, I'm going to go next to it, which is properties. It's the little color wheel here. And across the top here, I have some different selections. We're going to move not to object, not to material, but to something called texture mapping. It looks like a cylinder that has an orange and white checkerboard pattern on it. I'll click on that texture mapping. And so when this opens up, I get my texture mapping dialog box here, or my little window. And this texture mapping, there are a variety of texture mappings that I can apply to my object. This is a box, so the closest texture mapping would be, guess what? The box map. So I'll go ahead and click on the Apply Box Mapping button right here. When I click on that, I look up at my command line. It says first corner of base, or I can just select a bounding box. The bounding box would be a box that completely contains my object, whatever it is. In this case, a bounding box is exactly the same as the object itself, so it's really convenient. So I'm going to go ahead and say bounding box. There it is. So I have bounding box selected. It's going to ask me the coordinate system. We're going to stick with just the world coordinate system. That's just fine. And do I want this to be capped? Yes or no? Do I want there to be a top on it? Yes or no? Yes, I do want it to be capped, so I'll go ahead and do that. And you can see that as soon as I do that basic box texture map, this already looks a lot better than it did before. Once this is set up, I can look here and I can adjust some things. So right now it's set at x equals y equals z. That's fine. And all of these are at 48 inches. Remember, my box was 4 feet by 4 feet, which would be 48 inches by 48 inches on a side. So this mapping looks pretty good. If I want to repeat or change the number of times the brick pattern repeats on my object, I can do that down here in the Uvw Repeat section. I can change U, V, and W separately from one another. U, V, and W is essentially like X, Y, and Z, but it's for texture space rather than physical space. So if I adjust just one, it's going to stretch the image on one side versus the other. I'm going to go ahead and click the lock button so that I'm adjusting all of them at the same time. And then I'll change the UVW repeat. First one I'll do is I'll up it. I'll go to 2.0. And what 2.0 is telling it is make the pattern repeat twice on the object instead of once. So I've increased the number, and therefore the bricks get a lot smaller. If I wanted the pattern to get bigger, I would go down in size. So instead of 2.0, I might go 0.5. And that makes that a little bit bigger. So in order to determine the size of these objects, I have to have a general idea of the size of the brick. Is it a 3-inch brick? Is it a 4-inch brick? How many of these bricks would stack up to make 4 feet? And so depending on the object, you need to adjust the scale accordingly. So right now, these bricks would be a little over 6 inches tall. So that's too thick. So I really need to decrease that down. So maybe at 0.7. Yeah, that's about right in terms of the number of bricks for that 4 feet. So I've gone ahead and I've set that up. So I have my texture mapping. The scale seems appropriate for the size of my object. Let's go ahead and do a real V-Ray render and see what it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the little teapot icon to start a true V-Ray render. And lo and behold, it looks pretty much the same as the preview. So that's good. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. I don't need to keep watching that render. We'll let it render in the background. And I'm going to move on to some of my other objects. So let me go ahead and type show, which is going to show all my hidden objects. And then I'll hide this. And I'm also going to hide these objects here and work it just with the wall itself. So I'm going to zoom select it on the wall itself. I need to apply my material first. So I'll go to my V-Ray asset editor. I'm going to go to the material section. I'm going to expand out to the left. And I'm going to put a material on it. Let's see here. I'm hoping to be able to pick something a little bit different. I'm going to try these wood planks and see if that might work here. Let me apply material to selection. And there we go. So I've got these wood planks applying. And as we look at the texture, if we zoom in on it, okay, it's not too bad, but I can do better. So the same thing, I'm going to select my object. I'm going to go over into my texture mapping, in my properties, and then my texture mapping. And this wall, though it is not a perfect cube, it's still roughly in the shape of a box. So a box map is still a good strategy. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Apply Box Mapping to it. I'll do a bounding box again that just goes all the way around my object. I'll use the world coordinate system, and I'll go ahead and I'll cap it. And so, okay, that's good. The face of this looks pretty good. If I look at the end, it's not bad, but it's a little bit squished. And if I look at the top here, there's way too many repeats of the texture versus the side. As I look down here under my XYZ size, you can see that it's 144 by 12 by 96. Okay, that's true because that's the size of the object. But if I want the texture to be applied evenly, I can click on this X equals Y equals Z button, and it's going to average out the texture and the size of the texture such that it's consistent all the way around my object. So generally speaking on texture mapping, the X equals Y equals Z is your friend. You could do 1, 1, and 1. The problem when you do that is that the texture tends to get really, really, really tiny. So it's there, but it's really small. So the X equals Y equals Z tends to be a little bit better. There we go. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can see it. All right. So at least now the texture is even, but I still need to adjust my Uvw Repeat so I get the number of boards. So in this scenario, this is an 8-foot tall wall. These boards are probably 6 inches each. So ideally, I'd have about 16 boards going up here. So I would adjust this pattern. I'm going to go ahead and lock it. Let's try 1.5. And I'm doing this live, so I haven't actually counted these up here. That's like 10. Let's try 2. Pretty close. That's 14 boards. Try 2.1. And maybe something like that is about right. It's starting to feel like it's the right scale now. So I'm adjusting that scale such that this object in its size feels appropriate. And I think that's one of the big things. It's not a precise science, so we don't have to go in and say, oh, wait a minute, how many is it, and whatever. We're just trying to get the ballpark. We're trying to get close. So I have this close now. My texture on the side looks pretty good. It wraps around the side. And my texture along the top doesn't really match up perfectly with my sides, but it is at the same scale. So that's good. I will show you in a little bit how we can start to adjust what the top looks like. So for right now, we'll leave that the way it is. I'm going to go ahead and type show to bring back all of my objects, and we'll move on to the next object, which is this cylinder. I'll hide the rest of the objects. I'll hold down Shift, select all the rest of the objects, type hide, and then we'll work just with the cylinder. So there's my cylinder. It's once again time to apply a material to it. I'll do that by going to the V-Ray Asset Editor and picking a material for it. Let's look at the stone materials. Somehow this got really large. It's making it difficult to pick. Let's use this one. Let me apply material to selection. And now we can see it. So in this scenario, you can see that the default texture mapping has really kind of stretched those rocks around the outside. They just don't quite feel right. So I'm going to change my texture mapping on this one. So once again, I'll select the object. I'll go to my Properties window and then choose my texture mapping sub-window here. And this time, a box map really isn't the right choice. If I did a box map, which I'll go ahead and do here as an example, we'll do bounding box, world, cap it, yes. It looks fine if you're looking straight at the side, but you see that seam that appears? That's because when we're applying the texture to this object in a box map, we have one texture here that we're throwing at the object. We have another texture here that we're throwing at the object as if it were a box. Where the cylinder wraps around, we're getting two different images coming together, and it's causing that weird line of distortion right there. So it's not the right mapping. So to get rid of a mapping, I'll have the object selected. I'll come over here and say delete mapping. And now that mapping goes back away, and we get back to the default. So I could change my mapping, and instead of picking the box, I'll move over by 2 and choose to apply the cylindrical mapping to it. No surprise, it's a cylinder. You would put the cylinder mapping on it. So there it is, base of cylinder, or I can once again pick my bounding box. We'll go ahead and stick with the bounding box. Makes life easy. We'll go ahead and stick with world here, and we can go ahead and cap it for now. So I've gone ahead, and it now has cylindrical mapping on it. It doesn't look fantastic just yet, but we can come down here to our x equals y equals z. They are already set at x equals y equals z. That's fine. But I want to pay more attention to the sides here. So to me, the sides still look pretty distorted. So I might change and say, let's make the z value a little bit higher. Let's go, let's double it. So let's go to 96. Okay, when I went to 96, it stopped it from being as squished. I might even go a little bit higher, or I might lower these. I could go to 24 and 24. And that's really starting to look not too bad. Don't worry about the top. The top looks horrible. Okay, I know that the top looks horrible. But the sides look awfully good. So in this scenario, okay, the sides look pretty good. Let's change my Uvw Repeat here. Maybe we want more of those rocks going around this. So let's go to maybe 2.0. And it's starting to look like a little well or something with all these little rocks. Okay? So, as I said, the top is kind of messed up. So, to me, the cylindrical mapping works great for the sides, but for the top, it just doesn't quite look right. So in that scenario, I would go ahead and I would explode this object. I would take just the top. I'd get rid of the mapping on it, and then apply probably a surface mapping to just the top, which there it is. Which I can then go in with the UVW and change the repeat value if I wanted it to be a little bit bigger, and do it like that. So I'm manually controlling the top versus relying on the cylindrical. So by exploding the object, I'm able to adjust the mapping for the top separately from the sides. So don't be afraid of doing that in the context of your mapping. So that's the cylinder. You can go ahead and go back to show. And we'll move over into the sphere. There's the sphere. And let's hide the rest of these objects. Oops. All right, so now we're back to just the sphere. So with the sphere here, we're going to go ahead and apply a new material to it. So I'll go into the V-Ray asset editor and we'll apply some kind of a material to it. I'm going to go back to the wood and laminate, and I'm going to go back to those planks, I hope, because I think it'll be easier to see. So let me right-click and say Apply to Selection. There it is. And so now, as we look at it, we've got a little bit of a spiral going on. So this mapping isn't awful, but it's also not fantastic. If I went and I did the cylindrical mapping on it, like we did last time, bounding box, world, go ahead and cap it, I'd end up with a weird kind of seam at the top, because in a cylindrical map we're applying around the sides, but then when we put it on the top we get that distortion. So that's not the best mapping, so let me delete it. Guess what? There's a spherical mapping. So we'll go ahead and click on the spherical mapping. We use a bounding box, we use world, and then it's gone ahead and it's wrapped the object. So I can come back here, the x equals y equals z, that's fine at 48. The Uvw repeat is going to control how many times this repeats itself. So I can go to 2, and we get a smaller, we get more of the boards. So in a spherical map, it always looks great in this middle section around the equator of the sphere. When we get up here toward the top, there's going to be some distortion and there's going to be some squishing, no matter how we do it. This is classic for any kind of material. If you go back to, you guys remember in grade school where they pull down the maps of like the world, and you either had the one where Canada looked gigantic, or you had the one that had the little splits in it to try to make the sizes more even. Because whenever you unroll a spherical shape, you have double curvature. It's really hard to figure out how to flatten that out without causing a bunch of distortion. So if I took one of those projections where Canada was gigantic, and I made a material out of that and I put it on this sphere, it would be the correct size because it would adjust. So in order for me to have a material with this kind of a pattern on it that was appropriate in scale, I'd have to adjust the material specifically for a sphere. Truth be told, you wouldn't actually have a wood sphere like this where the bands would come around and match up without distortion. It's not a real material. So typically when you get into these spherical materials, they're going to be made out of metal, in which case the texture mapping, you're not going to get this kind of distortion with it. So I still like to introduce the concept and that there is a spherical map for your materials there. Let me go ahead and show the rest. There we go. And I'm going to move on to the pyramid next. Let me go ahead and hide the rest of these. And we'll take a look at the pyramid. Let me zoom, selected, and there's our pyramid. So if I go to apply the mapping to this pyramid, we'll first start with a material. I'll go to the V-Ray asset editor, and I'm going to apply some bricks to this because I think it'll be easier for you guys to see what's happening here. Let me apply material to selection, and there are my bricks. So as we go up this piece, some of the sides are okay. Like this side looks okay. This side, the bricks are running the opposite direction. Like this is a weird shape. So if I go in and I select the material and I go to texture mapping, I could apply a box map to it. And if I did a box map and I said bounding box, world, go ahead and cap it, it's actually shockingly not too bad because this object has 4 sides just like a box. So the seam between the two is always running up the side. Now where this breaks down a little bit is as we look at the brick here and we look at the brick there, even though they're about the same size, they're distinctly not the same brick because we're losing information. We've lost part of the texture as it applies flat. So it's not necessarily the best strategy. A cylindrical map could work if I took this and I said, let's delete that, let's put a cylindrical map on it. And we'll say bounding box, world, and I'm not going to cap it. OK. That's not too bad. At least it solved, this is now the same brick as it goes around. So that might not be a bad strategy toward getting it to work. There's certainly some distortion as we get to the top. We're getting a little squishy toward the top. But our other option for this is to actually control how it's mapping in a much more detailed way. And I'm going to do that using the Unwrap method right here. So if I click on Unwrap, it's going to say select seams. So if you go back to, what is it? It's 130, where you have to make those little paper shapes. You guys remember that class a little bit, vaguely, where you had to draw out the shape, then cut it out and glue it together? This is essentially what we're doing in Rhino. We're saying, okay, if I were to cut this and fold it flat, where do I want the seams to be? It will figure it out by default, or I can actually specify where I want it to be. So I could say I want to cut down this side, and I want to cut around here, here, and there, for example. So I've told it where I want to cut to be able to fold this shape out. I'll go ahead and hit Enter, and that then cuts it based on where those particular lines are. And if we look at the texture now, okay, it flows across the seam, and it flows down there as if this were unrolled flat. If I make this a little bit smaller, it might be easier to see. Let me change the Uvw Repeat to 3, just so you can see the pattern a little bit more. So you see how that pattern folds around the corner and then keeps folding around that corner. It'll continue folding around this corner, but this was where my seam was, so that's where it distinctly doesn't match. So it matches around most of the sides, but it doesn't match on that back end. If I want more detail in this, I can actually go in to this UV editor button, and I can draw on the ground here a big rectangle. And when I do that, it will show me, and actually in order to see this correctly, I need to turn off my infinite plane down below because it's blocking it. We will see the pattern shown, and then also the unrolled shape shown here. And I can then control how this pattern applies to the unrolled shape, and it will respond over here. So if, for example, I wanted my brick pattern, I could rotate this so that on this piece my bricks lined up correctly. So I'm controlling where they are on which piece. So I have the flexibility to make adjustments to the shape and have those adjustments apply to the texture on the shape itself. This is definitely an advanced strategy, and it's only necessary on really complicated objects. But sometimes it is, so I like to introduce it as a concept. When I'm all done, I'll click Apply over here. The texture map has been applied. I can go ahead and show the rest of my object. So I have that one done. The last one would be the cylinder. So the same thing with the cylinder here, and I might as well hide the rest of these objects for clarity. Same thing with the cylinder here. When I go to do the texture mapping on it, it's not an easy one to decide what to do. I think a cylindrical mapping is probably my best bet. So I'll go ahead and do a cylindrical mapping. We'll do the bounding box. We'll do the world. I'm going to leave it uncapped so there's nothing projecting down on it. Oh, and I do have to put a material on it. So bear with me for a second while we put some materials on it. All right, so there it is. The cylindrical mapping's been applied. I can change my Uvw Repeat, maybe 2, to get a few more rounds of that, like that. Reasonable. As we look toward the very top, there's a little bit of distortion, a little bit of squishing. No surprise. Likewise, at the bottom, it gets a little bit stretched out. It's just the nature of the shape itself. Let me go ahead and show all my objects. So I've gone through and I've applied texture mapping to these objects, which is great. I've gotten the scales right. I've gotten the size right and the orientation right. Sometimes you want to have finer control over how a material is applied to an object. I'm going to work with this cube first. So let me take the rest of these and I'll hide them. Again, I'm doing the showing and hiding just for clarity, so that when you guys see what I'm doing, you can see what I'm concentrating on doing. So let's say that I want to manipulate this texture a little bit more. Let's say I want to control where the pattern falls. So here I've got 2 bricks and then not a brick. What if I wanted a half of a non-brick to fall on the corner, for example? If I want that to happen, I can actually show the mapping on this object. So I can come over here. There's a box here called Show Mapping. And when I do that, it will bring up something called a mapping widget. It's this little yellow object with these little arrows in the corners. I can manipulate that mapping widget, and it will control what's happening to the texture. So for example, if I were to move this mapping widget over, you can see that the texture moves. If I moved it this way, I can move where the texture is applying on this object. Does that kind of make sense? Furthermore, I could rotate that object and control how the texture is applying. Let me undo it for a second so we're back here. And this is one place where there's a tool that's built into Rhino called the gumball that's great for manipulating materials. Some people love the gumball and use it religiously all the time. For me, it drives me nuts, except when I'm working in materials. So I will introduce it as a concept. If you like it and it works for you, you're more than welcome to use it. But I tend to not have it on. It's a personal preference. So what the gumball is when you have an object selected, it gives you this little kind of XYZ ability to drag an object, and then it gives you some rotations. So you can rotate the object. So it allows you to manipulate this object. So in this scenario, if I wanted these bricks to be on a diagonal, I can actually grab a hold of this green arc here, and I can rotate the mapping such that on the sides, the brick is applying diagonally. It's still applying horizontally on this side. I would have to rotate this shape in another direction to start to change how it's applying on this side as well. So by manipulating this mapping widget, this yellow mapping widget, I can control how the texture is applying. So I can move the texture around, and I can also control how it's applying to the object. I could also adjust the scale of this mapping widget to match up with the scale of the object. So I could, if I wanted something to be a little bit larger, I could scale this mapping widget and have it affect the shape as a whole. So let me go ahead and show all of them again. I'm going to go back to my wall here. Remember, I talked about this top maybe not being exactly what I want. I can come back to here, show my mapping widget. There's my mapping widget. In this case, the mapping widget is different. It's not the same size as the object. And I could move that texture to control where the seam would be. So if I wanted the seam to appear right there so that the top looked like it had a full board on it, I could do that. If I wanted it to look like it was a partial board, I could do that. So I have flexibility there in terms of controlling it. Likewise, if I wanted those boards to be on a diagonal, I could do the same thing where I could rotate those to be up on a diagonal. So this is just another way of manipulating these objects and controlling how they're being applied. Okay, same thing applies for every one of these objects. I can turn the mapping widget on, make my adjustments, and then turn it back off again. So there's a button for hide mapping widget, and that goes away. The alternative to that, if you have the mapping widget shown, I believe if you hit escape 2 or 3 times, it will let you out. There we go. I deselect the object and then press escape, and it lets us out. So those are the strategies for applying texture mapping to your objects. I'm now going to go back to the bridge file that we created a couple classes ago, and I'm going to apply a texture to that and get it ready to use in a final rendering. So I'll go ahead and minimize this for right now. I'm going to actually open another Rhino. If I was in Rhino here and I went to File and then Open, it would close this and force open it within the same window. Alternatively, I can just open Rhino again and then have another window of Rhino open. So I'll use large object inches. And there it is. And let me go ahead and go to File and then Open. And I'm going to open up that bridge file from a while back. So let me go into my folders. This was the bridge. Here it was my bridge. There it is. Now before, I'm going to end up bringing this in as a block. So I'm going to use it as a reference, and I'll show you the advantages to using block references. We're going to use them a lot in this class. So before I use any of these as a block, I need to clean them up. So this was set up so that I could do a little test rendering of it and post my rendering. When we're working with blocks, we're not going to use any lights, and we're not going to use any infinite planes. So I'm going to go in and delete the infinite plane altogether. So I'll press the delete key there. Oops. It was locked. Let me unlock it. Yes, go ahead and delete it. I'll also select my light here, and I'll press the delete key for that. Oh, sorry. Delete key. There we go. And I'm going to turn off the gumball because it's going to drive me nuts if I don't. And then I'm going to delete this extra shape. I don't need that one. So I'm down to just one object. And I also want to think about when it comes in, where do I want control of this object? So control might be nice right in the center of this bridge. So I'll move, type in move, that midpoint right there to 0, 0, 0. And that just gives me a nice control of where that object is. So I have that ready. I need to make sure that I've adjusted the texture mapping correctly for this object. So let me go ahead and switch over into my rendered mode. There it is. I'm going to go into my V-Ray asset editor. I'm going to go into materials. We can look at the various concretes. Looking for one that has some lines on it. Let's use that one here. I'm going to apply to selection. Oops, helps if you select the object first. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and apply this to selection. There it is. So this concrete has some texture to it. We can see that it has some form ties, it has some form lines. It actually looks like it has a mistake that was filled in. So it's got some stuff, some character to it. So I want that texture map to apply to this object as a whole. So even though I have separate pieces, so all of these ended up being little separate pieces, if I were to select the whole object, all of them at once, go to Properties, and then go to my texture mapping. I'm going to move this, make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. I'm going to go ahead and apply a box map. This is roughly like a box map, so we'll go ahead and apply a box map to it. I'll click on the box map. I'll click on Bounding Box, World, and Cap Yes. And suddenly, this starts to have a pattern that is kind of working. Let me take the whole object and let me zoom, followed by S for selected, just so I can orbit around the object like that. So I might decide here, it looks like there's a little bit, I didn't quite finish that part of it, so. But I might need to adjust that texture mapping. So once again, I'll select all of the objects, and the reason I'm selecting all of them is so that the texture mapping applies to all of the objects together. And then I might change the Uvw Repeat. Let's change that to maybe 2. Yeah, and you know, this grouted seam is really bothering me, so I think I'm going to pick a different material. So let me go back into my V-Ray. We'll try a different concrete. Try that one. Apply material to selection. All right, so this one has like form ties on it, but it's way too big. So I'd have to select that, and in this case, I might go to 0.5. Yeah, something like that's not too bad. Now, if I show the mapping, there's my mapping, I can once again control where those seams happen. So I could say, where do I want these vertical seams to happen? Where do I want the horizontal seams to happen? So I can kind of adjust that so that they look right on my object. Remember, I could also rotate it. So I think this is reasonable. I like it. I know this isn't finished on that back side, but it's good enough for right now. So now that I like the texture, I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Save. Actually, in this case, I'll go to Save As. And I'll put it into today's folder. Here we go. Let me make a new folder here. And I'm just going to call this Bridge. And we'll save it. Next thing I'll do is I'll open up Actually, let me leave that one open here for a second. I'll open up Rhino again. And let me go into open, and I'm going to open that spider clamp and piece of glass from last class. So we'll go into here. There was my sample from last class. There it is. Once again, I don't need my infinite plane, so we'll get rid of that. All I need are my glass object. We'll get rid of the light. We'll move this. I think controlling it from the glass itself right, if I can get it, right there at 0, 0, 0 would be good. Okay, so I have that established. I've already put my materials on this from last class. Now the two materials that I am using here, we switch into render mode for a second. One is a metal and one is glass. In both cases, texture mapping doesn't really apply because there's no pattern, there's nothing that I can see that's going to change that material. So there's no reason for me to go in and do texture mapping on these two objects. All I need to do at this point is save it. So I'll go to File and then Save As. And we'll call this, again, I'm going into today's folder here. Curtain wall. And I'll go ahead and click on Save. So I have both of those saved. Now I'm going to create a brand new Rhino file. So I'll go to File and then New, Large Object, Inches. And I'll go ahead and say Open. And in this file, this is where I'm going to assemble those blocks. I'm going to use multiple copies of them to build the bridge and the wall behind it. And so to do that, I need to establish the basic light settings for the scene. So same thing that we've been doing. I'll go into my layers. Under layer 1, I'm going to rename this to be environment. Next one underneath will be the infinite plane. I'm going to call it IP for infinite plane. Next one under here is the directional light. I'll take IP and DL, infinite plane and directional light, put them underneath the environment layer, take layer 4 and layer 5, and go ahead and delete those. On the infinite plane layer, I'll go ahead and add the V-Ray infinite plane. There it is. Once again, I'm going to change that color, though, just for working with. We can go ahead and view it in shaded mode so we can see, yep, it's been installed. My directional light here, once again, cheater box. Oops. Like that. I'll use my directional light. In this case, I'm going from here up to there. And so now I have that directional light installed there as well. I'll switch back to the default layer. And now it's time to bring in those two files. And so the idea of a block reference is really important in Rhino because you're going to build little components and you're going to use them over and over again in your big files. And we will even get to the point at the end of the semester where you'll have a file that is your site where the building goes. Then we'll build your building in a separate file. That separate file will then have sub-files that are loaded into that might be the furniture or whatever. And so there'll be multiple nested blocks. And there's distinct advantages to working with blocks in Rhino, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. So we need to bring that in. I'm going to go to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. I could also just press Control-I on the keyboard. And when I do that, I can bring in this Insert window. I can go look for that first file that I created. In my case, it was in today's folder. And it was called Bridge. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say Open. There it is. Now, when the Insert File option shows up here, this is really important. The name's fine. We get down to block definition type. So we can choose to embed the file, we can choose to embed and link the file, or we can choose to just link the file. The embedded is a bad idea. I'll tell you that right now because it doesn't give you any advantage for having the block. The embedded and linked protects you a little bit because it takes the file and puts it into your file. So if you lose the original, you still have it. It, however, ends up being heavy on your final file because you've got this thing that's fully embedded as opposed to just a block reference. So it is my preference, and what I would strongly encourage you guys to start working with, is to use just the linked block reference. So it means you have to save your original, can't throw away that file, but every time Rhino goes to open, it will go look for that file and load in just the block. And so it saves on computer power and lets you work a little bit faster. Furthermore, under layer style, I prefer referenced layer style, and I'll show you what that looks like. It takes your block and it makes a separate set of layers that are grayed out, so you know they're in the block versus just active layers. So for me, I would strongly encourage linked and reference for those two options. I'll go ahead and say OK. I'll say OK again here, and it's going to ask me where do I want to place this. So I'll say 0, 0, 10 feet. So it goes up in the air by 10 feet. It's a bridge after all. So there's my first little component. I want to make a bridge. So I'll take this component, I'll go ahead and copy it, and I'll just start stacking them together. All right, so I've stacked all of those together like that. I don't know where the bridge is coming from and where it's going to. I don't really care. We're just building the bridge itself. Next thing is I want a wall going right behind this bridge. So I'm going to bring in the same way that glass piece that we built last class. I'll go to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance, or I could press Control-I or type Insert on the keyboard. I'm going to go to this little folder icon to browse for my curtain wall. I'll go ahead and say OK. Again, I want it to be linked as a reference. I'll go ahead and say OK and OK. And I can then drop that little curtain wall in. So you see, once those two blocks exist over in my layers, I have all the layers for the bridge block, and I have all the layers for the curtain wall block. But, there they are. But they're grayed out, so I know they're part of the blocks. This helps with your organization down the road. When you have hundreds and hundreds of layers, you can tell which ones are part of the blocks versus which ones are in the scene itself. So I need to make some adjustments to that curtain wall. First, I need to rotate it. So I'll go ahead and type rotate, and we'll rotate the curtain wall so that it's going back that direction. I'm going to go ahead and move it over here a little bit, and it may help to look down to see how close the curtain wall is to my bridge. We'll put the curtain wall right about there. So when it comes to this, if I were to take this piece and copy it and go from here to there, I'd get the next piece of my curtain wall. You see how those fit together? It's a lot of work to copy and paste it that many times. So instead, I'm going to use what's called an array to array this and make multiple copies. So I'll go ahead and select it and type array. It's also available under, I think it's surface and then array. It might be, maybe it's transform. Honestly, I don't know where it is. So just type array. Then it's going to ask you for the number in the x direction. So that would be the number in this direction, just one. Number in the y direction, maybe 20. Number in the z direction, maybe 15. I'll press enter, and when I do that, it will ask me for the spacing of y. So the spacing of y is from the bottom here to the bottom there. And you see that as I do that, it starts to create a bunch of them. Same thing here. The spacing for z would be from here to right there. And then it gives me a preview of my wall. This wall is way too tall. I don't need it to be that tall. So I can go back in here and edit my numbers. So my, let's see, my z number only needs to be about 5. There you go, that's better. My spacing, my y spacing should have been 48. I don't know, I must have made up my snapping. My Z spacing is 72. That all looks good. And I now have that curtain wall to go behind my bridge. So at this point, I have everything set up to do my rendering. I have to accept it, though, by pressing Enter. So there it is. I can zoom in on this little bit here. So maybe I'll render something like that. And I could go ahead and I could render. Let me go and press this little teapot. We'll get the rendering engine started. And we could see my concrete bridge, and we could see my curtain wall starting to appear behind. I'm going to let that render, and I'm going to show you one of the powers of dealing with blocks. And if, let's say, that I went back and I said, you know what, I wish that I had a little bit more detail on this. Go back to shaded mode here for a second. You know, I wanted a wood handrail on top of this concrete. Well, I can create that if I want to. Let me go into my box here, and let's create this, and let's go up by maybe 2 inches. Maybe it's like that. Let me go ahead and move this over so that it's there. And it really needs to come all the way out. So let me scale 1D to just stretch this. That was a mistake. This needs to go to right there. Let's move it vertically by 4 inches. There it is. Let me add a little piece here. Let's move this into the center. There it is at the midpoint. Move this over till it hits. There it is. It's too wide, so let me scale. By the way, scale 1D is to scale in only one direction. We'll come and talk about that a little bit later, but essentially I'm able to say, take this object and make it only that big. So I have a little support. I have a little handrail. I need to go back in and adjust my materials. So let me open up the V-Ray Asset Editor here. I'm going to look under wood and laminate. I'll pick maybe that veneer here. We will take these two pieces, there and there. We'll apply the veneer to them. I'll switch over into my rendered mode so we can take a better look at it. And we need to zoom in at these. So they're not too bad, but it would be better if I texture mapped them. So we'll go ahead and select this first one. We'll go ahead and apply a box texture map to it. Bounding box, world. Go ahead and cap it. I'm going to do x equals y equals z. The texture is going the wrong direction here. So I'm going to go ahead and show my mapping. There's my mapping. I'll turn on my gumball. And we'll swing it in this direction. If I hold down Shift, it'll jump to 90 degrees. Now that texture looks like it's going the correct direction. The top seems reasonable too. So I'm pretty happy. This object here doesn't have its correct mapping just yet. I just did the mapping on this object though. So wouldn't it be nice if I could copy mapping from one object to the other? Well, guess what? We can do it. So let me select the object that I want to copy to, and I'm going to say match mapping, and it says select source object. There's my source object. And it will match the mapping exactly to what was above. Now in this object, the wood is actually going the other direction. So I'd need to go in and show my mapping, and then rotate the mapping again so that it was going in the up and down direction. So these are the kinds of details that really make your renderings look good. When you think about the direction of the grain of the wood, that would matter. This is going to be going up and down. This is going to be going along the length. So I've created it on one side. I would need to do the same thing on the other side. I'll go ahead and just take these two pieces. I'm going to copy them. And I'll copy right to the midpoint there, and I'll come over to the midpoint there, and that gives me the top rail on the other side. Now that those two have been created, I can go to File and then Save, and I save this file. So I did it in the bridge file. Then I can go and I can jump back to this file here where we did my rendering, and I can say, you know what, I want to update that bridge. Let's go to Edit, Blocks, Block Manager, and if I look at bridge, it says linked file is newer. Let me go ahead and update that. This material conflict will come up rather frequently. It's because the block that you're bringing in has a material that has the same name as is already in your scene. Generally, I say replace existing material and then apply all. That way you have the most updated version of the material. There it is. And you now see all the way along my bridge, I have that little wood rail. So at this point, I could go back and I could do another rendering. And this one would be updated to show that wood rail on top. So the advantage is that you can make these adjustments back on your first file, this one, and anytime you make that adjustment, it's going to reflect and show up on all subsequent versions. So if, for example, I wanted to put like a little drainage scupper in the side, I could take this, oops, trying to give myself those little, this needs to be a little bit taller. Take this and intersect. There it is. I could use that and the Make Hole tool, like we did to punch those windows. That would be my surface, and I could go through to the back side, and it would punch the hole for me. You guys get the idea. I didn't actually join these together, so it didn't punch the hole all the way through. But once I did that, and I went to File and then Save, I can again go back to this final version here with the wood already, go back into Edit, Blocks, Block Manager, and once again update this file. Replace existing material, apply to all, and now that change has happened there as well. So there's a real advantage to using blocks. Notice also that by copying and pasting the blocks, I've made it so that when I edit one, all of them change. So if you can build your building out of these components, it makes it really convenient when you go to make your adjustments later on or tweak the settings, etc. So your goal today is to understand texture mapping, then go in and actually texture map your bridge, maybe add some embellishment to it if you want to. Make sure your textures are applied correctly to your curtain wall. Bring them both into a new scene such that you can do a rendering of this new scene. And then you're going to go ahead and post the resulting rendering. So there it is. Maybe I'll do another rendering there. And then you would post this as your end result today. OK? Perfect. Next class, we're going to continue making new things. The difference there is that it's going to stop being so scripted, where I tell you this is exactly what you're going to make. I'm going to give you much vaguer description of this is what I want you to make, and then you're going to go make it, and everybody will make something slightly different. So we're moving in the direction of some autonomy, which I think is a good thing. All right? Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll turn you guys loose.